Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of Essex and the Talk Big Data series, which we're launching tonight. My name's Lorna McGregor. I'm the co-director of the Human Rights, Big Data and New Technologies project. I'm here at the University of Essex, and we are hosting this series together with the Administrative Data Research Network and the Business and Local Government Data Research Centre here at the University of Essex. And these projects are all funded by the ESRC and are major investments here at the university with a number of partners throughout the UK and internationally. In addition to these centres, here at Essex, we have a range of big data expertise and human rights expertise. We have the Institute for Analytics and Data Science and the UK Data Archive and UK Data Service, and as well as the Human Rights Centre. So this evening we're launching the Talk Big Data series, Big Data, Big Questions. Tonight we are focusing on charities, humanitarian action, and big data, friend or foe. And you will all have on your seats the programme for the rest of the series, seeing the range of topics that are coming up. Tonight we are going to have this panel, and I'll hand over in just a minute, but I would like to give some housekeeping introductions first. First of all, we are filming tonight, and if you do not want to be filmed during the question and answer session, you need to sit on the far right side of the auditorium, so over there, yeah, over here, if you don't want to be filmed. There are no planned alarm tests, so if the alarm sounds, it really will be an incident that you need to leave the auditorium quickly. The emergency exit is located to the right of the stage. This is quite difficult saying this when you're facing this way, so to the right of the stage. The bathrooms are also off the foyer towards the other side, and they're signposted through the doors. If you need any assistance, the Talk Big Data team are wearing landmarks or badges and are dotted around the auditorium. And finally, we very much encourage you to engage with the discussion through the hashtag #TalkBigData if you're tweeting, but please do ensure that your phones are silent during the presentations and question and answers. So before I hand over to my colleague, Professor Jeff Gilbert, who is one of the investigators on the Human Rights, Big Data and New Technology project and leads our work stream together with Dr. Chris Fox on humanitarian crisis and big data within the Human Rights, Big Data and New Technologies project, I would just like to explain how we're thinking about big data. It's one of the questions that we and our colleagues in the other projects are asked a lot. What do you mean by big data? And of course, it's quite a controversial and contested term, and there are many ways that we discuss within our project, and I'm sure discussed within the work that others do on big data, to define big data. But for the purposes of this series at least, we are defining big data as extremely large and or complex data sets that may be analysed by computers to reveal patterns, trends and associations, especially related to human behaviour and interactions. So we're talking about extremely large and or complex data sets that can come from many sources, and sometimes are coming from many sources in a small data form, but when combined or aggregated, turn into big data. So sources like social media posts, internet searches, mobile phone records, satellite images, government records like police records, death certificates, and vehicle registrations, weather sensors, and so on. Big data, for the purposes that we're using it, can be collected, collated, analysed, aggregated to inform decision-making. And tonight we're looking at the role big data plays and the challenges it poses in protecting and promoting human rights, addressing disadvantage, inequality, and responding to humanitarian crises. And that's something that within the Human Rights, Big Data and New Technologies project, we're very much always looking at. To what extent does big data and associated technologies pose major questions for the promotion and protection of human rights? To what extent does it pose risks, and can we overcome these? But also, what are the opportunities to promote and protect human rights, particularly in the context of humanitarian crisis? So I would like to hand over to my colleague, Professor Jeff Gilbert, who will welcome you as well, and also introduce the panelists tonight. I'm sure you'll see we have a panel of extremely distinguished and exciting speakers working at the cutting edge of these issues. So again, welcome to the University of Essex, and we look forward to this evening with you.
Thank you, Lorna. Yes, I think I am being picked up because I can hear myself. Right. My name is Jeff Gilbert, and I would like to welcome you here this evening to this, the first of the joined ESRC project talks on big data. Tonight's talk, looking at charities, humanitarian action and big data, friend or foe, brings together international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And I think most of us are sort of aware of international human rights law and big data. We all know of Edward Snowden, okay? We've all seen that aspect of human rights. What does GCHQ know about what I am doing? How much is Google following me? Okay, I can promise you, every time I click, the adverts that my children have been looking at come up on my web. No, but you see, we all know that side of human rights and big data. But what about international humanitarian law? What is international humanitarian law? It's another contested term. At one level, international humanitarian law is used to refer to the international law of armed conflict. But when you talk about the United Nations and humanitarian actors within the United Nations, you're talking about UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. You're talking about other actors who respond to humanitarian crises, which is much broader than just the international law of armed conflict, international refugee law, the law relating to internally displaced persons. All those aspects of big data, human rights and the humanitarian crisis is part of what tonight's discussion will look at. So, how can big data, okay, a relatively new area, okay, in this field, advance human rights and humanitarian responses? And what are the opportunities and what are the challenges? I'll tell you one of the opportunities. During the movement of Syrians from the Turkish coast to Lesbos earlier this year, UNHCR, using tweets, publicly available, okay, the BBC weather charts for the Eastern Mediterranean and tide tables for the Eastern Mediterranean, could predict 68, one way or the other, how many people would arrive on the island each day. That might be one day 200 people, the next day 1,300 people. Now, if you've got that level of accuracy, you can work out how many people you'll need to receive, how many resources you have to have in the right place at the right time. You can stand people down so they don't have to do 72-hour shifts. But one of the problems is, will the people on the ground trust that information? Because if they don't trust it, then they don't stand people down, and people did 72-hour shifts. 72 hours awake, waiting for arrivals. That's part of the problem. There's another problem, verification. How do you actually verify that? It's a real issue in this area of responding in humanitarian crises. Now, other issues arise to do with who has access to smartphones. There's a gender bias with access to smart technology. There's a rural-urban bias with respect to smart technology. How can we make certain that those factors don't skew how we respond? Tonight, we are very fortunate to have with us three people who, in their own work, use this information and try and improve humanitarian responses. I am not going to give long introductions to them. I am simply going to tell you the three of them, and when they give their first response in discussion, they can fill in for you how what they are doing helps them explain what we're talking about tonight. So, on my far left is Wendy Betts, who is Director of eyeWitness to Atrocities, part of the International Bar Association. Next to me is Joanne Mariner, Senior Crisis Response Advisor at Amnesty International. Apologies, I'm just going down my list. They aren't sitting in the right order. Yeah, that's small data for you. And in the middle is Duncan Ross, who's Data and Analytics Director for TES Global and Director of DataKind UK, a not-for-profit organisation that provides access to volunteer analysts to charities. And we've got several questions, at the end of which we want to give time to you to ask questions. But the first question, which goes to all three panellists, is how can big data be used to map, monitor and document human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law? And I leave it to you to describe yourselves and what you understand by those terms. So, shall I start with Wendy at the far? Yeah, go for it, Wendy.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of your evening to be here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. As I said, I'm the director of the eyeWitness to Atrocities project at the International Bar Association, and what we've done is develop a mobile camera app that can be used by human rights documenters, journalists, ordinary citizens to capture information related to human rights violations in a way that can facilitate its use further down the road towards investigations and trials. So it increases its evidentiary value over and above information you might capture using your standard mobile camera. So we're storing the information that all of the users collect, and that's how we can verify the chain of custody. So we are amassing amounts of information coming from different sources in conflict zones and other areas experiencing human rights violations around the world. So I think that's why I was asked here today. So we focus primarily on atrocity crimes. So we're looking at genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes in particular, and how to hold the perpetrators accountable. So I think if you're looking at how big data can be used, given the nature of our project, looking at documenting human rights violations, one thing I might clarify is that I think big data is the result of the documentation. And with the increase in tools that are available to everyday citizens, this is how we're starting to generate, I think, much larger data sets on what's happening in terms of human rights violations in some of these locations than we've had the ability to generate before. Which comes with potential and also comes with challenges. But now that we've been able to almost crowdsource documentation in some respect, we are amassing data sets that the human rights community is suddenly starting to look at and see how we can use them more effectively, both to address the violations in real time and to hold perpetrators accountable eventually. So I think how big data can be very useful is this ability to more easily identify patterns and trends more quickly to help promote a more rapid response and to be possibly more accurate about events and situations because you have first responders on the scene now generating information that investigators or human rights documenters may not have had access to until much later on down the road. And so I think there's a lot of ways it can be used to really help with the documentation and promotion of human rights.
Duncan, lead on. Same question.
Hi, my name's Duncan Ross. As I said before, my day job is that I'm Director of Data and Analytics for Times Educational Supplement Limited. Actually, what I do is I put together university rankings. So that makes me, to some extent, in a position of power here. And I can congratulate Essex University on coming 83rd globally in terms of their sociology work here. But anyway, in my actual other work life, I'm a director and trustee of a UK charity called DataKind UK. It's part of the DataKind network. And this was really set up because a group of people like myself who are working for companies, and we were doing things like predicting how likely someone was to buy something. And we were thinking, well, this is great for the companies, it's using big data, it's making money, but actually it's not really moving the world forward. And couldn't we use these skills to help make the world a better place? But rather than going off and doing, forgive me for this, the Californian thing of creating an app, maketheworldbetter.com, whatever, we work with charities. So charities come to us with problems, and we provide pro bono data scientists who work on those problems. The data belongs to the charity. They're the experts. They're the people who know how to make a difference. We're the people who can help them understand what their data can tell them about their effectiveness, how could they could maybe do more, and so on. So on to the whole... actually, I'm going to ask you a question. Who here would count themselves as someone who works with data, however you want to describe that? Hands up, please. Hands up if you're on the I'm interested in the humanitarian side. Not that they're necessarily exclusively, but primarily from that side. Okay, so that's interesting. So I'd say more, and not in either of those categories. Oh, well, there you go. So that's interesting. Quite a lot of people here from the data side, which I think is really positive. So what kind of things can we do in terms of using big data in this space? Well, the first thing to think about is the term data exhaust. And if you haven't heard of the term data exhaust, it's a really useful phrase that came out of the early years of the big data movement. And what it really says is that most people in the world today generate data just by doing stuff. And it's not an active generation. It's not you going in and typing stuff into Twitter. It's the fact that as you carry your smartphone around, it's constantly pinging. It's slightly more complex than that, but basically it's sending out RF signals that go to the local tower, constantly saying, hello, here I am. And that information is captured. And it's huge. It's way bigger than the stuff that most people deal with. And every single thing you interact with in the developed world generates data. The Internet of Things. You think the Internet of Things hasn't arrived yet? You're wrong. SCADA devices in industry have been there for years. Most of them are Internet available, and most of the ones that are Internet available have no security on them because the people who install them don't realize they're Internet available, which is interesting. If you want to run an experiment, try just pinging all those IP addresses, IPv4 addresses that aren't registered to people and networks, and you find SCADA devices. So there's all this data that's being generated. And even in the emerging economies, actually, increasingly, people are generating data. The days when you had to spend £600 to buy a smart device are long gone. The concept of landfill Android, if you haven't heard that phrase, basically the very cheap phones that are coming out of China now mean that Android smartphones are in the hands of more and more people around the world. And so all this data is being generated, and it can be used. Absolutely can be used. It can be used in a way that we simply couldn't use this kind of evidence before, because there is more evidence there than there are people to analyse it by hand. We need to use smart technologies to do that. And again, we're in a world where those smart technologies are becoming cheaper. Data storage. My first job, I worked for a student union, and I had a Mac SE30, for those of you who are historians of hardware. And it had an external hard disk drive, and it was about this size. Okay? It was 20 megabytes, and it cost about £500. And we were really proud that we had an external hard drive, not floppy disks. And nowadays, I can't even buy a thumb drive that's that small. It's just not possible to buy that anymore. So storage has come down hugely in cost, and the cloud has made this even cheaper. You can spin it up when you need it. The processing technologies, again, if you go back 10, 20 years, you were spending a lot of money to buy a SAS license or an SPSS license. Now you go download R for free, or you use Python pandas. So actually, getting the technology to do stuff is becoming incredibly cheap and straightforward. And at the same time, the techniques themselves are advancing. And for those of you who think that AI is never going to be able to do X, remember 50 years ago, AI couldn't solve the XOR problem, which was kind of a major problem. Beyond perceptrons came along and resolved that. 20 years ago, we were saying computers will never beat chess players. Until last year, we said, well, chess, that's one thing. Go, they'll never manage Go. Now that's gone. So actually, the techniques to allow us to interpret this data are becoming available, and they will be able to do some really powerful things. But there are challenges. First one, gathering the data. Where does the data come from? How do we get hold of it? And an interesting one is actually, can we pose the right questions? Can we pose a question that is correct and analytically makes sense so that the computer can answer it? And that's often one of the biggest challenges. As was mentioned, there are concerns about bias. Yes, data sets have bias. But if you work in data, you know that all data has bias. If you come and say my data has no bias, I'm assuming you've never looked at your data. Of course it has bias. The question is, do you understand the biases, and can you take account of those? But the final thing I'll say before I pass the baton on is that one of the things we need to be wary of is the idea that because data could be used badly, or the results could contain biases, for example, they could contain gender biases or racial biases, that means we shouldn't use them. Because we often try and set this artificial barrier that says unless we can produce an algorithm that is bias-free, we shouldn't use it. Well, what we should be thinking about, in my opinion, is it better than what we have at the moment? Because I can guarantee you the world out there is not bias-free. People who are making hiring decisions make hiring decisions based on racial profiling and gender profiling. Not necessarily realizing they're doing that, but we know when we analyze HR data that people who are most likely to get a job, frankly, are white men. You know, that's the way the world is. So if I can build an algorithm that is slightly better than that, it may not be perfect, but that's still a step forward. So we need to think about that. Anyway, I've rambled on enough, so I will pass the baton on.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I think what I have to say follows on well from what you said, because you described sort of the massive amount of data that we have in the modern world and how we've been developing the tools, and obviously the tools are still developing. And I think I'm going to try to describe a little bit concretely how the human rights movement and humanitarian movement can put that data to use and these tools to use. So I am a senior crisis response advisor at Amnesty International, which means that my job involves deploying to crisis zones, often war zones or scenes of serious political violence, and trying to document human rights violations and international humanitarian law violations in real time. So hence, the use of these tools, I think, is crucial. The speed that they can be used is crucial in order to create public pressure to stop those violations and to motivate governments and other powerful actors to take action to prevent violations. So in thinking about how big data and big data analysis can be used as a tool in this area, I basically broke it down into 4 categories where big data analytics is useful. And I think the first is in revealing patterns of violations, including previously unknown patterns. So if you assess, you analyze the data, you may learn a lot of things that you wouldn't learn via other techniques, via the traditional techniques that I've relied on for my entire career. I think data analytics can also be very useful kind of at the other extreme in providing a really fine-grained understanding of particular incidents. You can get something in such perfect detail from so many different perspectives. You can understand causation. You can understand other elements that you wouldn't otherwise be able to come to grips with. Third, it enables predictive modeling. And of course, that's where bias can be extremely problematic, and you need to understand the bias, as you mentioned. But still, predictive modeling is a very important field for humanitarian response, as you suggested in your comments. And finally, it can help policymakers reach informed policy decisions, because you need to have an understanding of the problems on the ground well in order to be able to come up with the policies that might remedy them. So I wanted to sketch out those 4 areas. I don't think I have time to go into detail in them. Let me just start, though, with the first, which is revealing patterns, because I think that's really important for the human rights movement, because traditionally I think the human rights movement is a very kind of qualitative approach to documentation. We're very good at documenting individual cases. We're very narrative-based, telling individual stories, amplifying individual voices. We're not so good at kind of cumulative analysis. And, we're not statisticians, we're anthropologists. We're not quantitative or qualitative. So big data can really fill that gap in terms of bringing to light patterns and showing, widespread and systematic problems. And just to give one example that is work that's, I think, becoming more and more important to us, There are a number of areas of the world in which we're effectively denied access, either because governments bar us or because the situation on the ground is so dangerous we're not able to go there. And more we're relying on satellite imagery to allow us to, have eyes on the ground to see what's going on there, often supplemented by refugee testimonies. But, a refugee may say their village was attacked. It adds a lot to your understanding of that and confirms that if you can get satellite imagery before and after showing the destruction to that village. One place that we've been doing this recently is Darfur. And one of the challenges there is that you have very small villages that may not be on any maps. You have hundreds of miles of desert, many hundreds of square miles of desert, and it can be very difficult to find these places. Well, what we've been doing to date is, one of Amnesty's strengths is we have a very large volunteer network. So we have volunteers who may be assigned, a 20 square mile area in which they scan and look for villages and evidence of destruction in satellite imagery. We've been able to show patterns of destruction. But imagine now automating that process. Having computers and trained algorithms that humans would train, and they would improve over time, but trained algorithms that could continuously scan hundreds of miles of desert and map out in real time attacks on these villages. I mean, that's to me really a quantum leap forward in the capacity of the human rights movement to monitor these places. And I think this idea of automating what is, incredibly difficult to do on a manual individual scale can be applied to many different sources of data beyond satellite imagery. It can be applied to, the thousands upon thousands of hours of, say, videos that are coming out of Syria. You train a computer to look for particular weapons. In Yemen, for example, we found evidence of US-made cluster bombs being used against civilians. Well, if you can use machine learning and train the computer to scan, thousands upon thousands of hours of video, identifying those cluster munitions, identifying US-made cluster munitions, you can make a powerful case. And you can make a powerful argument in favor of, stopping US arms exports to that country, which is one of the recommendations we've made. To cite a couple more examples, and this is an area we've been exploring. You can use data analytics to monitor hate speech and ethnically charged speech in order to potentially predict explosions of ethnic violence. And think about places like Burundi, South Sudan, Myanmar. Ethnic violence doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's normally accompanied by an explosion of ethnically charged speech. So, in many different areas, I think the use of data analytics and big data offers just a really powerful new tool for the human rights movement and the humanitarian community.
Thank you. Can I ask Wendy a particular question, which is, can big data be used to hold those responsible for human rights violations and breaches of international humanitarian law to account? I mean, there's questions there for international criminal law.
No, absolutely. And I think it's inherent in the definition that we're talking about and the point that was raised about identifying the patterns and the trends and the associations. So especially if you're looking very specifically at criminal accountability for large-scale atrocity crimes, the idea of patterns and trends and associations are really inherent in what the court has to prove to be able to hold the perpetrators accountable. So if you're looking at genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, you have to have a certain key elements. So one, the prohibited conduct had to take place. So there was killings, there was displacement, there was use of child soldiers. Whatever the specific violation that's prohibited has to take place. But what elevates that from a human rights abuse, a domestic crime, is the context in which it's happening. So for war crimes, it has to be in the context of an armed conflict. For crimes against humanity, it has to be widespread or systematic. For genocide, it has to be targeting a specific group with the intent to eliminate that group. And then if you want to hold the leaders accountable, who are not the direct perpetrators on the ground, you need additional linkage evidence, which comes in large part from what patterns that you can identify that can be circumstantial evidence that can help link the high-level leadership to those violations on the ground. And so I think this is where big data can play an important role. So you can look at magnitude of violations, you can look at patterns, you can look at geographic spread, you can look at just quantitative amounts of victims in order to make the arguments for the widespread or systematic that you would need to make a case for crimes against humanity. Similarly, with genocide, there's been situations where courts have inferred intent from the idea that specific groups of the population were victimized at a rate much higher than other groups in the population. So this argument was made in the Guatemala trial against Rios Montt that the indigenous population was targeted at a rate far higher than the non-indigenous population, and so the judge took that to be an indication that there was intent to target this group. And I think this information really only comes from being able to amass and analyze this type of data. Similarly, tracing associations between the direct perpetrators on the ground and the higher level authorities, you're able to look at using software, looking at linkages and who's linked to whom and what the chains of information flow might be to help make that argument that these people in the higher level positions knew what was happening on the ground, maybe ordered what was happening on the ground. With international humanitarian law violations for war crimes, the same thing. If you can look at if the patterns were widespread, if you had similar conduct taking place in multiple areas of a geographic region or over time, it's much more likely that there was a direct order or that at least those in authority knew and failed to act, which is enough to hold them accountable for those types of violations. So I think the information that big data can reveal towards magnitude, patterns, trends, victimization, et cetera, can be really helpful. But again, it comes with this caveat with the notion of being analyzed by computers. So I think the courts at various levels are struggling with just the vast amount of information coming in, and how do you curate it? And how do you curate information when you don't know what's going to be relevant until possibly 10, 15, 20 years down the line when you're actually bringing a case to trial? So how do you safeguard it, store it, identify it, catalog it, and then eventually find a way to analyze it to determine what might be relevant? So you can use some of these algorithms that are playing a very important role to spot weapons, to spot insignias, etc. But you don't necessarily know now that you're going to need that information. So you have the challenge of pulling it off open source platforms, of safeguarding and storing it somewhere until such time as it's clear what's going to be relevant. And there's still an authentication issue, and I think courts are a little slow in wanting to embrace technology and make change. And so this notion of you need qualitative analysis and human analysis of what's going on is still very strong. And so I think you have to have people looking at some of the data and making some decisions before it can be analyzed in order to meet the evidentiary standards. So I think it really can play a very important role, but there are certainly some challenges.
If you want a practical example from day-to-day life as opposed to humanitarian crises, I have a video from 1991, a mere 25 years ago, that I like to show to my students at the beginning of term. You ain't going to get a video player around campus these days. So a few years ago, I moved it over to a DVD player. Yeah, they're getting a bit rare on the ground as well. And so I ran round earlier this week taking the DVD data and putting it onto a USB stick. Who knows what in 25 years,
Exactly.
which all that information we now have, how will we be able to access it? Duncan talked about a 20 megabyte hard drive. My first hard drive was 10 megabyte. It's that.
We shouldn't be trying to boast about how small things were.
Yeah, well, but I think this is part of what big data is all about, because preservation of big data is something, and this leads me on to a certain extent to the question for Duncan, which is how can big data be used to map, monitor and document areas of disadvantage and inequality, and how can we make certain we can still access it?
So I think I'm going to come briefly back to something that Wendy said, because I think there's an interesting tension here between the kind of things that I would see as being sufficiently evidence to be useful from a big data perspective, which is really often around making individual decisions and taking action on those in the knowledge that some of those are going to be wrong, but as long as more are right than wrong, it works out. And the kind of evidentiary use of data in the legal system. And particularly, I think there's a real challenge there in having a judiciary who actually have I'm trying to find a polite way of saying this, but I'm not going to manage it, the faintest understanding of what statistics actually are. Mm-hmm. I mean, we can see this from the misuse of expert witnesses in the courts in the UK, that frankly, it's very easy to confuse the judiciary, and I don't even need to bring Dr. Bayes into the whole discussion to make that more complicated. Anyway, so how could big data be used to actually explore things like disadvantage and inequality? Well, we've already mentioned the idea of satellites. Satellites are really powerful in this because they can act as very good proxies. If I want to find out parts of the world where there is a lack of money, a great way is to look at a photograph taken at night. And I look for light. And if I have a city and there are areas which are well lit and there are areas that are not well lit, that is a very good proxy for inequality in income. And it doesn't need to be much more complicated than that sometimes. And yet it can be. I can actually use the same satellite images, and there was some work being done actually by universities in Pakistan around this, because one of the challenges of Pakistan is there are large parts of the country that either the government isn't really able to get into or just doesn't want to bother because it costs a lot of money and they're very remote. If they want to know about agriculture in Pakistan, how do they do it? And the answer is they take satellite images and they analyse the images to understand what crops are being grown, when, where, what times of year. So actually that's a very powerful technique. As I've also mentioned, mobile phone signals are great, and they're great in two ways. There's the obvious way. I can actually use these to understand things like movement of people. So there was a great project put together by UN Global Pulse. In 2012 was the original one, called Data for Development. And they worked with Orange France... I got my French accent went horribly wrong there. Orange France Telecom, who actually have the significant subsidiary in the Ivory Coast. And they used data from there about individual mobile signals, and they anonymised it. I have questions about whether it really was truly anonymised, but anyway, they anonymised it and then enabled it for organisations to come and do projects on to try and understand what was going on. And some of the things they found there were about the movements of certain ethnic groups within that country who were disadvantaged. And people had assumed, well, they're living in this area, they work in this area. Actually, they discovered that these people were moving and migrating to work on a daily basis. They were moving from area A to area B because that's where the jobs were. And this was something that hadn't really been obvious before. And they also know, of course, which routes people take, which is also powerful. If you look at sociological studies around movement, you tend to find out where people start from and where they go to, but you don't know how they get there. It's kind of appear one place and disappear from another. So there's a lot of interesting data out there. What else can we look at? Well, one of the projects that we did in DataKind UK is we did some work with Oxfam, trying to understand more about food prices. Because one of the big questions, of course, is not just are people providing aid to countries, but actually are they providing aid to the right part of countries? Is that aid having a desired effect? It won't be a surprise, but if I suddenly take a bunch of free grain into a country that has a famine, that might actually crash their agricultural economy. Because there may be a series of people who are living there who are actually on the margin of self-sufficiency and providing cash crops. I suddenly swamp the market with free grain. If it isn't in the right place, suddenly I destroy what's left of their agricultural economy. So actually trying to understand food price is quite an interesting proxy for that. Can you see differentials? And what we were trying to do there, and it wasn't actually successful, but in the spirit of big data, we should say that all analysis is useful. Failed analysis is equally useful because it teaches you what not to do in the future. One team went away and said this must be linked to fuel price because oil price is such a significant part of agriculture. They did a lot of work which showed that actually it had almost zero impact. Much more important was, no surprise, the actual environmental issues. So, is it the cycle? Does the rain come early? If the rain comes early, by and large, you have a successful crop. If it comes late, you're in real trouble. And really, agricultural economies can be that much on a knife edge. The other area which is really interesting, and again it's been touched on, is the idea of textual analysis. People often don't think of text as big data, but actually now you can start taking text, scanning it, analysing it, and then doing some really interesting studies to actually explore that. Yes, you can look at hate speech, although that is frequently very challenging, as what you often find when you try and look at sentiment analysis is there are the 10% which are obviously nasty and the 10% which are obviously nice, and this big 80% bit in the middle which is really confusing. If you want to take an example, just think of the way that the word shit can be used. It can be used positively, negatively, in an excited tone, in a despairing tone. It's a kind of universal word of many different inferences. But broader textual, I didn't go where I could have gone with that.
Thank you for that.
We are grateful.
Sorry, I'm now going to go slightly down. But there was a company who had a job of looking at images and deciding whether they were suitable for work. And basically, at the end of the day, there were ones that clearly weren't and ones that clearly were. And then there were a bunch of people who sat in the middle going, nope, yes, oh, I wish I hadn't seen that, yes, and so on for the actual images, because some of these are quite challenging to categorise. But you can actually also look at larger volumes of data, and one of the areas you can look at is actual legal judgments. And this is quite interesting. We have the European Court of Human Rights, which covers a vast range of countries, not just those in the EU, as we're obviously discovering a lot more about what the EU actually is now that it's too late. And you can look at the judgments that have been made, and you can actually see, were these actually implemented? You can compare the ECHR judgments with what happened in the country, and you can actually look at citations backwards and forwards amongst cases, and you can try and find the ones which are important and the ones which are actually being acted on and so on. So, again, one of the things you can do by using technology to go where it would take many thousands of hours of expensive lawyers, not that I've got anything against expensive lawyers, we can now automate that process and do some of that much more rapidly. So that's a very rapid scan through some stuff.
I was going to ask a question, again, follow-up to that. I don't know whether you know the answer. The Facebook map of the world that came out in 2010, whereby Facebook at one point just took a picture of all the links between people who were using Facebook, and then they superimposed that on the map of the world. And it again showed that issue of where are the connections, who's, and funnily enough, it did show there were links between East Africa and other parts of the world, but it showed who was talking to who as well. And this is part of this bias issue.
Well, yes and no, because network analysis is one of these really interesting areas of analysis that has been underplayed. Particularly when you look at cell phones, you suddenly have this degree of interconnectivity that you never had before. Again, this is not in the charitable sphere, but we did some work in my previous company for a telco in New Zealand who discovered that there was a group of immigrant workers in New Zealand who were phoning home to the Indian subcontinent that they hadn't been aware of. And from their perspective, this was a market segment. But in terms of social good, this is a community that clearly still have strong ties to where their families came from, and are building on those. And in terms of interconnectedness, we are highly interconnected. I can guarantee you that 6 degrees of separation is not a lie. I've looked at very large networks. Frankly, the number of steps you need to get across is tiny.
Joanne, a question that we talked about earlier, and so maybe we want to discuss it together, but I'll let you lead on it, which is how can big data be used to strengthen the ability of charities and humanitarian actors to respond to humanitarian disasters, and to what extent is a predictive approach possible in those cases? So I'll start.
I know that you have sort of probably even more experience than I do in the humanitarian field, because my area is human rights, although I work very much in areas often of humanitarian disaster or armed conflict. And I think the short answer is that this tool is already becoming extremely important. And as the tools develop, as the software improves, as artificial intelligence becomes, more and more, I guess, intelligent, I think it's going to be a crucial tool. We saw, I think, the sort of what many people point to as a starting point was the response to the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, where you had humanitarian agencies and public health officials teaming up with Haiti's leading mobile phone network to obtain information tracking cell phone movements to find out where displaced people were going in order to provide them with food and medical services and so forth. So, your phone is a tracking device. And as cell phones become ubiquitous, you can map the flow of people pretty well just following those cell phone signals. You mentioned UN Global Pulse. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's the UN's kind of flagship initiative that's trying to put to use big data, and it basically has a lot of pilot projects around the world utilizing big data analytics to facilitate and improve the provision of humanitarian aid. So just to cite a few examples, they have a project in Kampala that's tracking the implementation of a program to prevent mother-to-child HIV transmission. And what that program does, it receives information from local offices on kind of a variety of factors, but including prenatal and antenatal care, numbers of patients receiving HIV treatment, and so forth. And it synthesizes and analyzes all that data and then provides it back to local officials in order to facilitate the efficient provision of treatment. And in a country like Uganda, you can't, it does have to be provided efficiently or it's not going to reach enough of the population. In another East African country, they're using cell phone data. Again, cell phone data I think is one of the most kind of promising sources of data for a lot of this work to assess food security. So they're looking at people's buying of cell phone credits and linking that. They've managed to do a study that links that to household incomes and ability to buy, basic foodstuffs. There's another project in which they're looking at unsustainable uses of water, as in fish farming, and advocating for changes that would stave off drought. So, I think really every area of humanitarian aid can use this kind of data, to make their provision of aid more efficient and as mentioned too, to enable predictive modeling. And I think that's probably where the most, challenging and potentially exciting uses of big data is, in order to use the data to look at what's going to happen in the future. I mean, as you mentioned with the refugee example, how many refugees are going to arrive on a given day so you can be prepared to receive them. I know that the Swedish Migration Board is one of the first kind of early adopters of this sort of big data analytics approach. And they've managed, to hire staff in advance, prepare offices and so forth, prepare housing and humanitarian aid based on big data predictions. So, I think probably next we'll have a chance to discuss some of the dangers and risks that need to be grappled with. But that said, the possibilities are really promising and really exciting.
I mean, one of the things that struck me years ago, I went to Kenya for a meeting with UNHCR. And everybody in Nairobi, and when we went out of Nairobi, was using their cell phone to pay for stuff. You bought credit, and that's how you paid for stuff. And that was everybody. My cell phone at the time couldn't do that. Okay, Apple Pay might seem like a sort of a really... no, it wasn't. It's years behind, okay, at one level. Okay, and it's that sort of... So there's a sense in which we need to know what's going on globally. There really is a sense that sometimes the global north is unaware of what is actually being done. What I was going to talk to before we come to... There is one more question to go to everybody, but there's something I want to talk to. And it goes to it does affect all of us. I was at a thing called the Global Protection Cluster in Geneva a few weeks back, which the UN brings together all the actors who are in humanitarian crises. That's the Global Protection Cluster. And when I'm talking to them about big data, funnily enough, although they're working in areas where there are massive human rights violations and violations of humanitarian law and all the rest of it, they don't talk about human rights violations and violations of humanitarian law. They talk about drivers and triggers. What are the drivers of displacement? And what are the triggers that actually make people move tomorrow or later today? And it's that part of big data, so that we all take... Big data's out there, there's a lot of it. How do we actually make certain we're asking the right questions? Because for those actors, they couldn't care less about whether it's a human rights violation, violation of humanitarian law, which we think is important, okay? They worry about, okay, what's going on the ground? What are the drivers that make people think about moving? And then what are the triggers? And they may be human rights violations. They may be the fact that the military are heading their way, and who knows whether the military are going to abide by the principle of distinction, which a whole load of people out there are going, oh yeah, I learned about that in class the other week. But it might not be, okay, the way that actors on the ground think. So I was going to ask you, the data that we have, we like to keep it secure, but sharing it in a way with other humanitarian actors, that's one issue for all of us. Who do we share with? Who don't we share with? And how do we start asking the right questions? And are there some questions that are so general they make no sense because the data is so big? And I'm looking at Duncan when I say that question because, yeah.
No, so, yeah, some interesting thoughts there. I think usually you can find good analytical questions which are relevant to a particular problem. Sometimes it takes quite a while to work through what those are, and often that's because people who are leading humanitarian aid or leading charities don't have a background in analytics or thinking that way. Often they've been practitioners, they've come through the practitioner route. And so actually one of the things we spend a lot of time doing at DataKind is actually trying to help people express what they're trying to achieve in a way that's amenable to analysis. I think there are also some interesting tensions there between what I would say is a big data approach and what I would see as, well, I don't know how to describe it really, kind of a macroeconomic approach. Because usually when we're talking about predictions in big data, we're talking about predictions at an individual level. So I build a model and I score lots and lots of examples, and then I may aggregate those up in different ways, rather than saying I think there's a 20% chance of rain. I want to know what are the odds, and then I look at how that moves. So, and that has interesting things to talk about triggers. Yes, because lots of people will do lots of different things. It's when they do it in mass that you suddenly get these big movements, these big challenges to face. Does that take you anywhere down there?
Yes, it does, because it's almost as though we have to train people to think in a different way to ask the questions that we've always been asking, so that we can ask it in, because the information might be there. How do we train people to ask the right questions of big data? Or is it the same questions we've always been asking, we just got a bigger pool to ask it in?
I don't know that it is necessarily the same questions we've always been asking. And this is part of the challenge we face in the way that a lot of this work is done. A lot of this work is done by not-for-profits, okay, who are intensely keen on doing good and actually getting out there and doing it. In fact, to the extent, and often, and let's be clear, with very, very limited budgets, they get the scraps that are left over after governments do everything else. And the focus there tends to be on the doing and much less on the measuring. And to the extent that we see some organisations who are actually very worried about measuring at all. Because what happens if I'm a charity, my objective is to do X. What if I discover all the stuff I've been doing, and X, by the way, is not delivering food stuff, typically, or doing the action, it's solving the problem, which is a higher order challenge. Your goal isn't to intervene, it's to actually move to a world where these things don't happen. Imagine you got to the stage where you said, well, actually, we've been doing all this stuff, we've been doing actions, but actually they haven't had the impact we thought they were having. And they may even have made the world a worse place, because that's entirely possible. Go back to the lesson of marketeers. Many years ago, marketeers thought mobile phones, someone gets to the end of their contract, what we should do is send them an offer for a new contract. That must work, it's marketing, it's going to be great. Turns out that increases the chance that people will leave your mobile phone company. Because people say, I've been on this contract for 24 months, I hadn't realised I was getting to the end of it, now that I know, I'm going to leave. Okay? And the same is true in the charitable world. Just because you're doing stuff doesn't mean you're making things better for the people that you're acting on. We hope you are. But often people aren't measuring, and they're even scared of measuring, because what happens if I discover that I'm making the world a worse place?
If I could just interrupt, actually.
No, I'm not saying
I'm definitely familiar with skepticism about measurement. My understanding is people are much more skeptical about, we often work in very kind of intangible or hard to measure, let's say, areas, maybe not intangible. And so people are skeptical about the accuracy of the measurement. I mean, I think human rights groups, humanitarian groups, their goal is to improve the situation. So if they were confident in the measurements, they would want to know. I mean, we absolutely don't want to do anything counterproductive. I don't think any group does, honestly.
No, I wasn't saying that at all.
Yeah.
I believe every single group really wants to do the best they can.
But I mean, if the best we were doing turned out to be ineffective or counterproductive, I think any group would want to do something else and would want to find different approaches. I mean, maybe this is a slightly tangential conversation, but I don't believe I think there's a skepticism about the ability to measure some of these things that are having to do with creating pressure for government action and so forth. They're not quantitative in the sense of, counting P's. Now, maybe it does relate in some sense to artificial intelligence and big data, in that we're becoming, just as computers couldn't even win tic-tac-toe at one point, and now they can beat the best chess players, now they probably can suck in data and measure things in a much more sophisticated way, or at least we're getting there.
Yeah, but you're right there, that actually the challenge is often, how do I understand what it is I need to measure? And how can I actually ask? That's the question. What is measurable? What actually shows the impact? And all too often, the easy things to measure are the doing rather than the actual effectiveness.
Right. I mean, providing a certain number of blankets is easy to measure. Yeah. Creating public pressure to stop capital punishment over a 40-year period, that's very hard to measure.
I was going to ask then all three of you, starting with Wendy, okay, what are the challenges that big data poses to the work that you're doing? And so, because that's something that I think we need to address as well.
So I think a lot of the challenges have come up. So I'll just focus on a few that we tend to face basically on a daily basis, working with local organizations in the field who are doing documentation and really kind of creating the big data set. So we designed the eyeWitness app so that anyone who uses it can keep a copy of their image for their own work and for their own work product and their own mandate for their organization. And then we keep a copy, and the copy that we keep is what we use to be able to verify the chain of custody. So we have one clean version that comes to us that we store and we maintain, and we have the longevity as an organization to hold on to it for the 5, 10, 15 years that may be necessary before it could be used towards an investigation. And so that was the idea, that we'd have a copy of everything, and then the organization still owns their own copy. So that comes with a lot of questions that we answer with every single group who's interested in using the app about ownership of the information, storage of the information, and who has access to the information, and who we might be sharing that information with. And then, in particular, when we start to amass information from different organizations documenting similar events, similar locations, we're building the big data set from which we're able to identify patterns that any one of those individual data sets may not show, that we want to be able to use towards accountability to paint that larger picture. But again, it comes with a lot of sensitivities about with whom would we share it? What if it's a national government asking us for it versus if it's the ICC prosecutor asking us for it? So these are very serious concerns to the individuals on the ground, and rightly so, because this is information that they are taking a great risk to collect, even if they're not identified in it, even if we don't know who they are, just by virtue of what they've taken a photo of or what information they've captured, it might reveal who they are. So the idea that it might go to a bad actor is quite frightening to them, and especially when you're looking at these high-level cases where they're going up against a defendant who has the means and the access to cause very bad things to happen to them and their family. So these are big concerns. It's very sensitive information. Equally so, are we sharing it with other NGOs? So the information for them is currency. They have grant funding or other things to collect this information. Their ability to report on it and advocate using it is what drives their organization. So if we were to share our copy with another group who would use it to do the same thing, could undermine their efforts. So this notion of, as you're compiling information, who can see it? How do you safeguard it? How do you build trust with people of how it's maintained? And if you don't have a convening body, those challenges, I think, rise tenfold when you have consortiums of groups trying to figure out who owns it, who maintains it, who judges access, etc. I think that becomes quite difficult. The other issue I would raise, again, is the trust of the data consumer, and this has come up. There's a lot of skepticism, and especially in the judiciary, about statistical analyses, any type of quantitative analysis of this information. The notion of garbage in, garbage out is applied, I think, quite liberally across the board. How the idea that you could measure and understand the amount of bias isn't easily understood, I think, in this context. And then, how has it been authenticated, even, in terms of our app? How do you know it hasn't been hacked? How do you know it's not fake? So that trust, and here are the safeguards. Here's how our encryption works. Here's how our hash value calculation works. If the courts and others don't understand it, it's not really going to matter. So the one last thing, and this also may be tangential, but the previous conversation reminded me of it, is the expectations on the ground for the individuals who are collecting this information. So big data and some of the information analyses we're doing, I think, are necessary for progress to happen. It's necessary to form the basis of these policy discussions. You can't have them effectively if you don't have the information. It's necessary for accountability. It's necessary for deterrence. But it's not always sufficient. So I've talked to groups who've said, I've been documenting things for 5 years. You have the most information you're ever going to have about this situation, but nothing's being done still. And so I think that limitation is very visceral on the ground. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind as we promote new technologies, new ways to analyze, and the possibilities of data are also the political will drawbacks.
Yeah, I think that's some brilliant points there. Because I think one of the things where there's definitely opportunity is about joining different data sets held by different organisations. Because the world isn't disjointed like that, and we have, particularly in the world of NGOs, boundaries which are there because this is a particular organisation, this is another one. The problems they're dealing with either cross or relate. And we had a great example where we were working with a charity, with citizens' advice bureaus, and with a charity that dealt with homeless people. And we were trying to build predictive models that said, if someone comes in to the citizens' advice bureau, what are the things they might talk about which would give us a reasonable reason to believe that at some point in the future they might become homeless? It's not actually housing, funny enough. And we weren't able to build particularly good models, but the first challenge we had there was how do we join the data sets in a way that preserves the anonymity of the people involved, because this is highly, highly sensitive. And it's a real challenge, because fundamentally, anonymity is a big challenge in the area of big data. If you look at cell phone tracking, for example, because although cell phones can be tracked, actually, regular cell phone tracking isn't very accurate. So if you're looking at tower signals, it's pretty poor unless you explicitly start to triangulate. Smartphone tracking is somewhat different because your smartphone has a GPS indicator in it, which is very, very accurate. But general smartphone tracking isn't particularly accurate. But even then, you only need 5 or so points to uniquely identify a person. So there's a real challenge there. Can you actually guarantee anonymity? My personal view is I think anonymity is dead. You can't actually really guarantee anonymity, particularly as you start linking together multiple data sets, which is very, very challenging because although big data can be used for good, it can equally well be used for bad. About the only thing protecting people is that, generally speaking, governments are less efficient and less good at doing things than corporations are. You can argue whether corporations are good or bad, but they tend to be slightly more efficient in terms of analysis than governments are. The NSA may be an exception, but since they're going to hear everything we say tonight anyway, we might. So there's some real challenges there. I don't think there's necessarily an answer at the moment, and I certainly don't think that simply taking yourself off the network is an answer, because believe me, you take yourself off the network, you're creating a U-shaped hole, which is just as easy to track, if not easier, than if you're on the network. That wasn't very positive, sorry.
No escape. And that actually reminds me that I recently read that last year the CIA created a directorate for digital innovation. That's a big data focused directorate. It's the first directorate the CIA has created since 1963. So obviously...
It's a directorate for Cuban cigars.
It's a good time for that, yeah. So clearly, I mean, big data is a tool that can be used by governments, by national security, and, you know, hopefully on the good side by human rights organizations and humanitarian agencies. In terms of the challenges for organizations like mine, I mean, I see two large areas. First is just practical. As I kind of mentioned at the outset, human rights researchers traditionally are not computer scientists. They're not quantitative experts. They really fall on that kind of qualitative end of the spectrum. It's almost a clash of worldviews. I mean, really, we don't even know computer scientists. So there needs to be a lot more cross-disciplinary collaboration, communication, discussion. I mean, both sides have things that the other side doesn't, and they need to share information and, you know, learn to ask the right questions and so forth. The other really important challenge, and you've just kind of made it, I think, even larger than I was aware, but that's the ethical challenge. This technology is developing so quickly, it's certainly outstripping efforts to develop ethical guidelines and policies. You know, organizations like mine have very, you know, strict and carefully hammered out guidelines about our use of individual testimonies, about getting informed consent when we interview people. We're very good at dealing with, you know, the individual case, but we don't have policies for big data, and a lot of organizations don't. On the good side, I know that UN Global Pulse has developed a set of privacy and data protection principles, so they're, you know, kind of forging ahead in this area and at least recognizing the issues. But obviously big data poses threats to individual surveillance. I mean, we started by discussing Edward Snowden. You know, his revelations are a really important example of that. It offers, I think, really daunting and worrying possibilities for discrimination. There's a lot of kind of computer programs that could just be a proxy for racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination. So, you know, as big data becomes more and more of a tool used by humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations, we need to develop policies and guidelines, ethical policies and guidelines, to help us use them, you know, appropriately and responsibly.
Thank you all. I'm going to quickly summarize what we've heard and then open up the floor to questions. In a vain attempt to anonymise myself, I've knocked my nameplate on the ground simply because I've managed to make the timing so badly we don't have as much time as we should have for questions, but I'm looking over there to the people who must be obeyed. They will tell me when we have to stop the questions. Just to give a quick background, quick summary then. Big data's out there, okay? And it should not be ignored. But we've got to start figuring out the right questions. And it can influence governments. It can, over time, change policies at the micro and the macro level. So it can be used for good. And if it means that people's lives are saved and that violators are brought to book, then it's criminal on our part not to try and use it. So I think the panel has presented all the fears, but all the promises too about big data. And I think that's something that we should thank them for in the usual way before I open it up to questions. Okay, so thank you one and all for an amazing insight to all the issues. Thank you. Right. We have 2 roving microphones, I believe. Yes, we do. We will have 2 roving microphones. I'm going to do this using old technology. Please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. We've stunned you into silence. You're all afraid if you raise your hand, the CIA are going to come after you. I see a question. No, I see a question down here. A microphone is going to make its way to you. No, it's going to make its way to the first person.
Right here.
Aha. Yeah, well, go there. Right. Wonderful. And then.
Hello, and I want to say the exploration was quite invigorating, but then there are questions to do with measurement and how bias could be first dealt with. Because obviously dealing with the big data, like somebody was pointing to garbage in, garbage out, and also the lack of expertise that surrounds the whole gathering of that information, and also how that it is integrated into the wider spectrum of data usage. So my question is, with that sort of gaps existing between the theory and the data collection and the amount of data that is available, obviously there's a lot of analysis, because from my understanding of using Understanding Society, which you know is quite complex with about 40,000 households, when I did the analysis of that data set, obviously it was not an easy thing to go through and to come up with something that is more robust and something that you could then use to inform policy. So I'm just wondering, with this sort of all different departments, and some of them with very little in terms of analytics and understanding of some of the measurement techniques and algorithms, how this can actually inform policy without some form of adjudication from statisticians or other people who are more enlightened in terms of the data mining, and then how then which can be refined in terms of bias, even in terms of representativeness of different ethnic groups that we are dealing with. Thank you.
Do you want to try that?
Okay, can I take 3 questions, and that will be easier. So do we have more people to ask questions?
Right behind.
Okay, so there's one beside you.
Sorry.
Yes.
Of course, in many areas there's already some methodology. If you do think of a screening for a disease in the population, you may use a screening technology, but afterwards provide some better analysis to verify if you're right. If I do think you as well have to keep in mind, if you got a wrong prediction, that you will affect the situation. As similar for many years already in medicine, one tries to not to tell a patient that the patient is under risk, because in principle if you do so and you get it nearly always wrong, then of course it has a heavy impact on the patient, but there's a lot of methodology already. And then of course if you do think of image data, again that's really big data, image, and to identify the characteristics somewhere in the image, to identify if there is really a reliable indicator. Therefore, I think there really has to be more communication if we go for these data sets and try to screen via satellites, via mobile phone and so on, but really use a similar approach, because this approach is already there for many years, because at the end of the day you have to make sure that you do get it right.
Just go that way.
A couple of you have mentioned that the judiciary might not have the right skills to be able to use and analyse big data or understand the evidence that they're being given. So I know in the statistics world there's initiatives to try and improve the statistical literacy. What are you doing to try and improve the literacy for big data in areas such as the judiciary?
Okay. take those 3 questions, and I think that might be it, but we'll see how long we've got. Okay, so who wants to start? Go for it.
Well, the microphone's over there. So
I think it picks us all up.
Oh,
it's clever.
It does, doesn't it? So I'll try and deal with a couple of those questions. I'll not touch on the judiciary one, though, except peripherally. So the first question, how do you... my reading of this, and forgive me if I'm wrong, was really about how do we make sure that we have effective ways of dealing with this. And certainly what we do at DataKind, and what I also try and do in business, is build up teams that have a combination of people. So in DataKind, we work with people from charities, and the charities have to be there through our events. We don't take their data and go away and do stuff and then present it back. They are there all the time because they can provide the context that says, this is what this data means, this is how it was gathered, this is the kind of problem that might have existed during gathering it, this is why some of the data is missing, and so on. And they can also tell us whether or not the outcomes that we're starting to generate make any sense to them. Because I think, it was you mentioned earlier, if people don't have faith in the predictions, then even if the prediction is right, they simply won't use it. So building teams is crucial, and actually finding that blend of people who have statistical data mining expertise on one hand, but also the people who have the really deep knowledge of the problem on the other hand is crucial. The comment earlier about why can't we learn from what's done in health? We absolutely can. I've seen those images up in Siemens, and they're really interesting. There's some fantastic stuff there. But of course, there is statistical guidance to help here, and it's the difference between type 1 and type 2 errors, and actually understanding the differential cost there. You can be wrong in different ways, and in different circumstances, that error can have different effects. So in medicine, medicine is made wonderfully more complex by the existence of a placebo and the nocebo effects, which, by the way, placebos are linearly strong. So 2 sugar pills are twice as effective as 1 sugar pill, which is really quite a bizarre thing. A saline injection is even more effective, and a placebo operation is the best thing you can have in the world of placebos. But type 1 and type 2 errors are really important here because, of course, in medicine, the challenge is if I give the wrong information, that has a cost to the patient. But the same is true in the world of, whether you're taking stuff to a judiciary or whether you are looking at providing aid. Taking your aid to the wrong place has a cost. Okay? Taking no aid to a place which needs aid also has a cost. And when you're looking at the effective predictions, you need to understand that balance and actually take that into account when you're making your decisions. Because the prediction is the first part. It's not the end. The decision is the end.
I mean, I guess just following on that, it's worth keeping in mind that these algorithms are not static. They learn. And there's, an area called deep learning where every experiment is not only something, or every analysis doesn't just lead to a result, it feeds back into the algorithm, and so the algorithm is continually improving. Failure is like a teaching opportunity. Just on the question of judicial literacy, I mean, I don't know of particular projects or efforts to make judges more literate in big data and data analysis. But I just note that, judges are generalists. They deal with areas of specialization all the time in their work. I mean, judges are not bankers, and yet they deal with cases involving financial transactions, the banking industry. They deal with, competition in industrial sectors and so forth. So, the mechanism you have to bring that expertise into court is the use of expert witnesses. So people who have, objective educational criteria and experience that show that they know that what they're talking about, and they can explain it to a judge.
Can I plug the Royal Statistical Society's work in trying to actually encourage people to understand the general use of statistics as a thing?
And just to follow on that, absolutely the idea of expert witnesses and people to inform the court, because that's absolutely correct, that judges often have to deal with information that they're not specialized in. In terms of specific initiatives underway, I know of a few more in terms of digital evidence more generally, not necessarily big data sets, but the idea of how information collected by technology can be trusted and how it's analyzed and used. And so there's a number of nonprofit and university-based groups who are working on the international level with the international bodies in terms of advising on some of these issues about storage and cataloging and retrieving from open source platforms, and how do you verify it, and then how do you trust that verification of it. And then on national levels, it's a whole different challenge, because it depends on the legal system, it depends on its history, and it depends on how well developed the society is. So one example, we were talking about not having a DVD player. In one area where we were working, we did some studies on the case law about to what extent have they used digital evidence before, and to what extent have they looked at photo and video evidence. And it turns out the court didn't even have a video player to play it. So you couldn't introduce it because they didn't have the technological capacity. So again, on the national level in different locations, there's different nonprofit groups, either international or local, who are working to build the capacity, change the laws, do trainings for legal professionals, workshops for judges, because you don't train judges, on how to address some of these issues, what questions to ask, what to look for.
My apologies. If you have a question, you can't ask it, and it's all my fault. It's run the panel properly. At this point, I'm going to hand back to the Director of the Human Rights Centre, Professor Lorna McGregor.
Thanks. Okay, well, I'm sure you all agree with me that it was a fascinating start to the Talk Big Data series. I've certainly learned so much from your discussion, and thank you all so much for taking the time to come here to Essex to speak with us, and thank you very much, Jeff, for excellent chairing. We would now like to invite you to join us in the foyer for a reception where there are people on hand from all three of the projects, as well as the panelists, and we'd be very happy to speak with you more about everything that's come up tonight, because you will have the opportunity to ask the questions that we didn't have time for here. And again, just to let you know that next week we have the Big Data in Business, Help or Hindrance, at the same time, in the same location, for the next in the series, and the rest are on the programme on the 10th of November, 17th and 28th. So thank you so much to our panellists, to our chair, to everyone who's put this event together. I really should say that the team within the three projects have absolutely done an amazing job of pulling this all together, so we're very grateful to you all. So without further ado, perhaps you might join me in thanking the panel one more time, and then we'll proceed to the foyer for drinks.